Premier Scott Moe announced the provincial response to U.S. tariffs on Wednesday. Moe says the SLGA will stop buying U.S.-made alcohol and selling the existing stock to retailers. In addition, future government capital projects have been paused temporarily to minimize or eliminate their use of American materials. The opposition has criticized how long it took for the government to announce those countermeasures, and they are going to stay, according to the government, even with the pause in those tariffs. To break it all down, we're joined by Mandryk, who writes a political column for the Regina Leader-Post. Good morning, Murray.
Good morning.
So, Murray, as I mentioned, Premier waited a little bit to make his announcement. We heard from other premiers a bit earlier. What was your reaction ultimately to what the Premier said and when he came out to meet with the media?
I'll deal with the latter. This is one time we didn't need a slow-mo replay to see the goal. You know, honestly, it was he needed to get out the first day, as Wab Kinew did in very strong language, standing in front of the Manitoba legislature with a massive Canadian flag. Doug Ford was waving the Canadian flag, talking as much as, gee, I might go down to the U.S. and campaign during the primaries. That's how mad I am about it. And obviously, he canceled Starlink. Both Kinew and Ford and other premiers across the country were pulling American booze off the shelves already, examining contracts. And we were, at that particular point, begging for a response from Scott Moe that first day. Now, Moe's response is 24 hours doesn't really make a difference. There's a lot of balls in the air. We needed to see what was going on. And I guess the argument was, since now the trade tariffs are at least temporarily paused again, then maybe that makes sense. But the fact of the matter is there is times when people want to see their leaders. They want to be comforted by that notion. They want to see that they're on side with the general message that they want their leaders to deliver. And I think to a certain extent Scott Moe was, in the sense that he did give the federal government credit for not at least going full bore. But he's a little bit off key here. He truly is. And I don't necessarily am suggesting that he's putting himself or in a position where he's not delivering the same message, but he's certainly not delivering it as strongly. And I think that might be a choice because he's been down in Washington. He's been talking to Republicans. He's somewhat like-minded. They're probably in his ear about not doing things, they being the U.S. Republicans, to further rile Trump and whatnot. But I don't necessarily think that that's either the best strategy or that he should be necessarily taking advice in that particular way. I think he needs to basically be looking at what it is that's going to help or bolster the entire Canadian message and what the people of his province are demanding of him. And I think even Conservatives right now are demanding that he sends a strong message, at least Conservatives that aren't the Goonie birds that want to join the United States right now. So I think from that standpoint, he needs to be careful here. He can't slow play this and maybe try to say that, gee, I was somewhat separate from the rest of the cabal that was just slamming the United States at this and Donald Trump at this time. You want to be on the right side of history on this one. And I'm not 100% sure that he's positioned well in terms of that in the long run. He needs, I think, to be a little stronger.
Yeah, polls are suggesting that the pro-Canadian sentiment is increasing. Anti-American sentiment is also increasing, and Trump's numbers are going down in Canada in these polls. Moe said, we're on the same side. That was something that was not quite the Team
Strange
Canada
comment,
thing. Yeah, the Team Canada thing that we'd heard. When it comes to you had a column this week talking about instances in which Moe has come out and acted stronger and with stronger language when it comes to things that were facing the government, whether they be immediate issues or not. So what comes to mind when you think back at some of the previous actions of the Premier? Well,
herein lies the problem, because everything that he's come out strong has come out of this right-wing populist wave that obviously Pierre Poilievre had been riding for a while, and certainly Donald Trump had been riding in the United States. And in essence, it's an anti-woke agenda, anti-trans, anti anything that represents change of threats. So the incidents that I'm thinking about is the pronoun bill. And I'm just absolutely flabbergasted that a little bit more than a year ago, we were having an emergency session on this silly pronoun nonsense that could easily have been handled in school that affects very little. But we didn't have an emergency session on something that's slamming our economy right now, which is these tariffs. And I don't necessarily even know we need an emergency session on that. But my heavens, if you're going to have a session on the pronoun bill, why would you not on this? And this, I think, is sort of the problem. Scott Moe has ridden these waves because this is his sentiment. We saw in the middle of the election, the number one priority was change rooms, and whether a couple trans kids happened in one community happened to be using a different change room. How on God's green earth would that be the number one priority? And think back into the context of the day and how silly that sounds in the greater scheme of things in terms of how that affects you. And this is a little bit problematic for Scott Moe because I think he likes the populist wave and likes to ride it, and he has. And I think a lot of it is represented by things that either Donald Trump says or at least those supporting Donald Trump. And he is having, in my mind, a little hard time making these divisions now that Donald Trump and MAGA represent something totally different. And that totally different thing is basically a threat to our very nation. And I think that's long been the problem of all premiers who have stuck a little bit too close to the Trump sentiments or the sentiments that got him into office at least, and have rode them too long. It cost him in the election, and even to a certain extent, the whole issue related to the teachers' strike and the issue that we're talking about, classroom complexity, was all about, well, we can't have these silly, strange, woke notions about complexity in classrooms. Let's just get in there and teach. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think that Scott Moe sometimes misses those nuances when he's basically trying to appeal to the base. It really started at the time of COVID, and when he wasn't necessarily an anti-vax guy, but he certainly started to appreciate the anti-vax sentiments by the end of things more than he did in the beginning. And I think it was one occasion where he needed to stand strong. Once again, it's one of those things history is going to judge.
You and I have covered rallies, carbon tax rallies that the Premier was at when it was affecting the economy, and that was the argument. And one of the things that I found interesting this week was some of the premiers who had been for a Republican in the White House, or even endorsing the president. Now they're the ones that are coming out and saying, "Hey, well, we got to stand back." Doug Ford comes to mind when we talk about that. You mentioned there the STF and the strike, and we covered a lot of that as well during the last number of months. We had the arbitrators ruling finally. The STF's calling it historic. They got a raise. They got classroom complexity part of the contract. That was something that was the major sticking point. Looking back at that, Murray, it wasn't a lot about the numbers. It wasn't a lot about what the teachers wanted as far as a contract. That wasn't the main issue. It was about classroom complexity and classroom size. So what do you make of what the arbitrator has decided?
So the arbitrator has decided. It's been bizarre to me because the notion of classroom complexity, and it sounds a jargony bureaucratic term, but it's hardly a woke term or anything else. We're talking about classrooms that have too many kids. We're talking about classrooms that have too many issues with kids with different needs, with kids that are struggling with the English language, with a few other things, just generally pressure on teachers. And even in rural Saskatchewan, there's tremendous pressures on teachers because sometimes classroom complexity means having 2 or 3 grades in the same class because of declining rural populations. So it's not necessarily some weird, bizarre, trendy concept. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled in BC in favor of the BC Teachers Federation that in essence that it is a bit of a charter violation not to be able to deal with this particular issue because it affects your workplace and everything. And that's almost a decade ago. And this was the argument teachers were making for months when the government was putting up billboards, when Jeremy Cockrell, then the education minister, was saying that the teachers were making outrageous demands and it was all about money. Well, in fact, the demands that they were making weren't quite what they got in the contract. But the arbitrator's numbers actually were pretty close to what the government was offering in the end, which seemed to be quite satisfactory to the teachers. Obviously, people in contract negotiations make the highest demand possible and down. But the interesting part to me was the whole classroom complexity issue, where the arbitrator ruled it is and should be part of the process. And that's a huge blow to the government right now, because we are in the middle of the previous mess we were talking about, the trade war. We are going to see a budget in a little less than 2 weeks and a little over a week. And that budget already is showing signs of leakage, or in terms of floating some kind of thing vaguely resembling that isn't a massive deficit. Certainly won't be a surplus. It'll be a budget. And that's because they're paying for a lot of stuff. They're admitting that right now, that they have to account for these wage hikes. And if you look at the protracted negotiations with the teachers, we're paying back pay for the teachers right now as taxpayers, going back to 2023 and 2024 right now, because the government couldn't get their head around these issues. And what's happened in the meantime? It's cost them seats in the cities. You know, I'm sure if Paul Merriman and a few other of the Sask Party MLAs lost and looked at why, they have to be examining some of the policies that their government was putting forward that didn't go over big. And certainly one of them was how they handled the teachers issue. And it was a particularly big issue in the cities where issues like classroom complexity tend to be real issues. It isn't just a word. It isn't just a trend. It's something that we need to basically discuss. And the government chose not to. And I think they're paying the price for it.
Murray, thank you.
You're very welcome.